I designed and built a 3DS TV dock, and I'm pretty sure it's the first ever. It works just like a Nintendo Switch dock, complete with USB-C and HDMI, and you can even connect a Switch Pro controller to it. This, like any of my other projects, took way longer than expected. It took hours of CAD design, soldering, testing, and solving the many unanticipated obstacles to get it both functional and eye-catching. So sit back and join me on the journey of turning my 3DS into a Switch. But why did I spend all the time and mental strain to get it to work? Nintendo has a history of bringing handheld consoles to the big screen. The obvious examples are the Switch and the Switch 2, but there's also the Super Game Boy for the SNES in 1994, and the Game Boy Player for the GameCube in 2003. I mean, I know the Wii U was some form of handheld hybrid, but you couldn't go out of range with the gamepad or it would cut out. Hardly a portable console. So, how come there was a 14-year gap between Nintendo's last handheld consolizer and the Switch's release in 2017? That seems unfair. There would have definitely been demand for a dock for the 3DS and DS line of games. The Switch's sales numbers show that. They did release a few docks though. The first was even bundled with the original 3DS at launch. Then later revisions came for the new and new XL models. However, all of these only charge the console via these pogo pins that connect to the contact pads on either side of the charge port. And you can only use a Nintendo 3DS charge cable because they don't have a USB port. So that's not quite the same as a Nintendo Switch dock that not only charges the console but also has HDMI out to connect to a TV. So we have to figure out how to convert the 3DS display's signal to an HDMI stream and also how to use an external wireless controller with it. We'll see which one is more difficult. I've ran over a few ideas and I have something in mind that should be possible. Although, has anyone else done this before? I searched into the depths of the internet, mainly just YouTube to be honest, and found a few that were a similar idea, but they relied on a Wi-Fi network, a PC running a couple programs connected to that same Wi-Fi network, along with the 3DS, and due to this it has high latency and can be inconsistent depending on your Wi-Fi setup. So with that, let's lay down a few goals and features for the build to guide it in the right direction. So first up, it has to be small and it has to look like a dock. It can't be too much bigger than the console. Of course, it has to be able to plug in with HDMI to any TV, and it has to work with a Switch Pro controller specifically. Any extra compatibility is a bonus. It needs USB-C power just like the Switch dock, and of course it has to charge the console whilst it's plugged in. Since there are no existing docks to draw inspiration from, we're going to have to go with my original idea for the layout. Perhaps the most important part is the console itself. We are going to use my Ultimate 3DS console from a previous video. Click up here if you haven't seen it yet, but wait until you finish this one. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. One of the upgrades we previously installed in this build is the USB-C capture card. This bad boy reads the screen data and streams it to a computer, but a computer is obviously a bit big, so we need something a lot smaller that will actually fit inside of the dock. I want it to be a comparable size to the Switch dock. Thankfully, the developer of the optimized capture card that we installed in the 3DS also developed the streaming software for a much smaller computer, the Raspberry Pi. A surprisingly capable computer in a tiny footprint, and most importantly, it has HDMI. We just need to somehow manage a bunch of wires and ports to get the thing connected to the console when it slides into the dock. I'm going to install the software onto the Pi so we can do a test boot to make sure it's working before we design the dock itself. After downloading the software files, I installed them onto an SD card and followed the included instructions, which were all in Japanese. Now we can plug in and boot up the Pi and run through the setup and install. Now, whenever the Pi is turned on, it will boot straight to full screen display of the 3DS. This is the start of what is probably the most challenging part of the build for me personally. CAD, Computer Aided Design. I used Blender as a teenager, but I've been learning Fusion recently, which is much better suited for what we're doing here. Although I haven't made many drawings so far, and certainly not one requiring as many different parts and precise measurements as this. So I began with a simple block model of a Switch-style dock, but fitting the dimensions of the new 3DS XL. I got reference scans of both the Pi and the new 3DS XL online. They help a lot with lining everything up and save a lot of time. So my general idea is to have the Pi off to the side with the ports exposed so that we can plug them in. But I'm not sure whether to make the ports on the top or on the side, because we need to wire the 3DS capture card to the USB port. We may have to manually solder those connections instead. Anyway, before we do that, we have to make sure we can figure out how to connect a Switch Pro controller to the console. Without that, this project isn't really going anywhere. Instead of reinventing the wheel, I'm going to use this open source wireless adapter from Blue Retro, which will take the wireless Pro controller's inputs and translate them to something the controller mod can understand, which will then, in turn, press our buttons on the console. These can be found on AliExpress for quite an affordable price. I've added a few links in the description if you wanted to take a look yourself. But I chose this because it's nice and small and will fit easily into our dock. It also has a status LED and a connect button that we can retain. This particular GameCube version of the adapter runs on 5 volts, but our controller mod runs on 3.3. So we've got to make sure we don't cause anything to burn up. Thankfully the Pi has both 5 volts and 3.3 volt pins, so we can tap into that for power. Since we haven't installed the controller mod in the 3DS yet, we're going to instead be testing with this DS from a couple of videos ago, where I built 4 of these and played them all simultaneously with a single controller by using my Kazakh split module. Check it out if you haven't already. We can see that it definitely doesn't work by directly plugging it into the console. We're going to have to power it with the Pi. I'll wire up the voltage and ground wires to see if we get anything. The pinout looks relatively simple. Black should be ground, and then red is our voltage, and white is the data line. We need to connect these up to the adapter and also some pins to plug it into the DS. And with that done, we can finally test it. Boom. We've got power. But after plugging it in, we get nothing. I hooked up my logic analyzer to see what's going on, but from what I can see, it's just polling for the controller, like a first greeting from the controller mod, and the adapter is not talking back. Ghosted. Safe to say this adapter isn't compatible with the controller mod. Hooray. So now what? Well, thankfully, I've got a bunch of random parts and devices lying around, so here is an N64 version of the exact same thing. It takes a Bluetooth controller and converts the button presses to, instead, an N64 controller signal, which is important because the N64 controller is compatible with Loopy's controller mod, and it also runs on 3.3 volts. We just have to hope that it's compatible. After cracking it open, we find that it is almost the same as the GameCube one, but with a few components missing. So let's rewire this guy in place of the old one and hope that it works this time. We have power and the controller connects. I'm using a PS4 controller at the moment. But do we get input.
Oh, no way. Oh, yes.
I think that is a sufficient answer. We've got it. Now that we have a few of the features working individually, we have to figure out how to package them together and wire everything up, which means back to CAD to design the case for all of the components. Our basic box design is not going to cut it, so let's think how we can lay out everything that it's similar to a switch dock but adapted for our parts. I added some bumpers to the sides to more easily line up on the USB-C ports, and a ramp on the front because the 3DS needs to be slightly open for it to stay on. We've also got to make the cutouts for the ports on the bottom of the console. I'm placing them similarly to in the switch dock, but here we have 2 ports instead of 1, and they are off to the side instead of in the middle. I've recently learned to at least just roughly model all of the parts that I don't have scans for, so that I can lay out where they fit more easily. We need locations for the USB-C port, display control buttons, and the wireless controller adapter. I've ultimately decided to place the Pi vertically with the SD card port at the top. I found this to be best as the power and HDMI ports can be easily accessed from the inside, as well as the SD card being conveniently on the top with external access. And I think it's closer to how the Switch dock board is placed. Next, I create some posts for the Raspberry Pi to sit on within the shell and build some walls up around it to encase everything. I want to try and use as little glue as possible. Some parts will have to be epoxied in to ensure they are solid, but for all of the others I'm going to design them to slide in by fit. After finishing off the first case, I split it from the console slot portion to print it out and do the first test fit. It's mind-blowing how many different options of plastic there are nowadays. I love these glitter ones. And USB-C port doesn't fit, controller adapter doesn't quite fit right, and the buttons also don't fit. But the Pi is fine. And this is why we do a test print first. So, back to the drawing board to fix it up and add our few final parts. After adjusting all of my incorrect measurements, I'm designing a middle bracket to hold all of the components in place, whilst having cutouts for the ports. Then a back plate is fit on top, sealing it together whilst also allowing for the cables to run out the side. And to finish it off, we're going to cut out a 3DS logo on the front plate, just like the Switch dock. The first full print of all 5 pieces of the dock was a bit quicker than I thought. Coincidentally, the 5 pieces is the same number of shell pieces as the new 3DS XL. And I've decided on connecting the pieces together with these Lego style cutouts, and we'll glue them together later. More issues. Woo. The USB-C ports don't line up, if you can see here. Needs to shift over a bit. I'll probably fix that by hand because it's internal and this piece takes the longest to print again. After testing the fit on the other parts, there are a few bad fits. Again. And again. And again. But overall, everything is logically placed. Actually, no, not even that. The cutout for the cables needs to be on the top, not on the bottom like I've done. I mean, that seems so obvious now, but not only that, the HDMI cable can't even plug in. There's not enough space on the side, so I've got to move the USB-C power port somewhere else or cut it down and shift it over more and... Do you know what?
I really don't want to do more CAD.
Let's switch it up. No more CAD for now. Let's refresh ourselves and install the controller mod and figure out the port for it. To build the controller mod board itself, we need our microcontroller that will translate the controller to the 3DS 3 capacitors and 2 resistors for the power and data lines. After cleaning up the factory holes from the PCB, we can plug in the heat plate. This little thing is fantastic and a perfect size for small PCBs like this. I've used this so many times and it's never let me down. It's a little tank. I'll have links below for some of these tools and parts that I use, including this if you want to pick some up for yourself. Basically what this does is plugs in via USB-C and then allows you to set a temperature and the top plate will simply heat up to it. This makes micro-soldering components to PCBs much easier. First I'm going to tin up all the pads and components before placing them on, and here they are. As you can see, they are tiny. Sneeze and they're gone. I'm also going to add a bit of solder to the chip to make sure it connects properly. Then we can place all of our components in place on the board and make sure the orientation on the chip is correct. After everything is cooled in place, I'm going to touch up all of the pins to remove any blobs or shorts. The last step now is to connect it up to a PC and flash it with the controller mod program. And then we can install it into the Pikachu Yellow 3DS. This is the most technically difficult part of the entire build, and it's not even directly part of the dock. A long time ago I used to wire these up by hand, and that's 23 individual wires that need to be soldered from the mod board to the console. So you can imagine how long that would have taken to cut, tin and install every single one of them. Thankfully, since then I've designed my own Flex PCB to speed things up for us. It's much the same as my Flex PCB for the original DS, although the new 3DS XL has much smaller solder points. So we'll definitely be needing the microscope here. You'll see how small they are now after we've disassembled the console. You can see the optimized capture card is already installed, but don't worry, I've designed this flex board to fit around any capture card install. The solder points we need are all across the board. The first connection is the only button not on the flex board due to its awkward location. So instead I'm going to solder down a wire. But we must be careful not to bridge the pins on the connector right next to it, or our home button won't work at all anymore. No problems here though. I mean, I've done this quite a few times. As always, to make sure it doesn't rip off, I'm going to add some UV resin to cure it in place. Then after tinning up all of the points for the flex, we can stick down the PCB in place and line up the flex board. Then solder all of the connections down and solidify the flex in place with more UV resin. These 4 points in particular are very difficult. They are so close to adjacent points and incredibly small. Without the resin, these would rip off if the console was dropped. But now we don't have to worry about that. Let's not forget to connect the home button wire and the power and ground connections. After that, all that's left is to wire up the port for the controller. I'm using a USB-C port to keep it the same as the capture card port, and I'm going to be installing it here opposite from it. There's plenty of space in the shell and there's a little gap above the motherboard right around the same place, so it should work just fine. To cut out the hole for the new port, I'm going to quickly program my CNC machine. I haven't used this location for the controller mod before, so I need to map out exactly where I want the machine to drill it out. Again, these shell scans come in super handy here. And now we can load it up and let her do her thing. Beautiful. Perfect every time. I'm using some 2-part epoxy to stick the controller port in place. This stuff hardens like a rock and will make the port super stable. The cure time is up to 24 hours, but instead of waiting that long, I'm just going to speed it up. Heat speeds up chemical reactions, thus making it harden in just a few minutes. Now that it's turned into a rock, we can cut, strip, and actually, wait, that doesn't sound right. We can split and unsheath the wires and solder them into the port and the pins on the PCB. Insulation is very important here to avoid any potentially damaging shorts. Snap, snap, and we are done. Let's finish this. After that break, I feel refreshed and have thought of a couple other revisions too. So after fixing all of my previous errors, it turns out I didn't make a pathway for the display button wires. I've also added some ventilation holes above the heatsinks of both the Pi and controller adapter. Now is what should hopefully be the final print. Not the most satisfying support removal, but the parts came out perfectly and they all hold in place, whilst also looking mesmerizing. I feel like I've just assembled the Millennium Puzzle from Yu-Gi-Oh! Or something. After a last test fit, every single component lines up perfectly and the cables can actually plug in now. But let's not forget about the console slot. These ports are still a little off and I'm not gonna print another one. So the Dremel is coming to the rescue once again. I suppose I could use the CNC machine, but that would take more time to map out than it's worth for a one-off. I'll fix it later in CAD. And just like that, everything lines up. That is all of the design and prototyping done. Now that we have all of the parts and components that we need, we can begin the final assembly before seeing if it actually works. I'm going to be using the same 2-part epoxy in the polymerization spell card and apply it to the USB-C power port. Next is the 3 display menu buttons so we can change the image scaling right on the dock. These also need to be epoxied in. The same goes for these Lego connections. I know it looks a little messy, but trust me, it will be strong, and it's all on the inside anyway. Before installing the components, I'm going to get everything wired up, starting with the display and controller plugs. The controller only needs data and ground, whilst the display needs USB, so 5 volts, ground, and a pair of data signals. Then I'm going to solder a couple wires for power and ground to the wireless adapter. Looks like the epoxy is solid now. The buttons are clicking perfectly. But what part next? Oof. This thing looks good. I'm super happy with how the shell came out. I think I'm going to set the plugs for the console in next. My idea is that I'm going to insert the console into the dock and then plug the 2 USB-C connections in, then slide it in place, and then I can add a bunch of epoxy around the plugs and leave it to cure. That way they are curing in the exact orientation of the ports on the console. That means all of my measurements for the port angle don't matter, and it will align perfectly naturally. But I need to make the USB-C cable a little less thick to be able to pass it through and actually plug it in. And I finally got it. All of the wires thread through the little passage hole I've made, and we can add the epoxy. Unfortunately, I can't use a heat gun to speed this one up as PLA, the plastic this is made out of, has a pretty low melting temperature, so the whole bottom will start to warp if I did it.
Many hours later.
Solid as a rock. And there's our 2 ports. I know my dremeling was a little messy, but PLA gums up pretty bad with a metal Dremel bit. But overall they look pretty good, so now we can hook up the controller port wires over to the blue retro adapter and insert it down in place. Then we connect the power and ground for the adapter and the USB-C cable to the Pi, but I don't know the pinout for the USB pins because they aren't written on there, but that's no problem. We've got a multimeter and a cable. With a quick continuity test, we can see which pad corresponds to which pin for USB, so I can make sure I'm soldering them in the correct order. A little more UV resin to secure them down, and we can lay the Raspberry Pi down in place and route the wires. But wait, there's more wires. 6 more for the front buttons to be specific. I've added some routing for these in the shells so they don't get crimped by the backplate. I bet you thought we were done with wires, but no. There are in fact 2 more for powering the Pi, as one of our rules states that it has to be powered by USB-C just like the Switch. I'm simply going to wire both 5 volts and ground from our new USB-C port to the pins on the original micro USB port. Thankfully, most devices don't use that port anymore, but this particular Pi revision isn't too new because we don't need too much power for the display and audio. It works! The controller mod is lighting up and searching for a controller too. Now we can attach the new revised mid-plate. Plate fits like a glove. And that's all we need to test it, so I'm going to insert the SD card and give it a whirl. We all know it's bad luck to put the last panel on without testing it first. The cutout for the LEDs is just right, and the HDMI cable actually fits now. Okay, we didn't break anything during assembly. That's great. After attaching the last panels, we can actually dock the 3DS and see if it works. And no signal. No signal. This is when I remember that the 3DS has a magnet sensor to detect if the 3DS is folded, thus entering it in sleep mode. The magnet in this case is the speaker in the top half. So for the 3DS to be on in the dock, we can either remove the Hall effect sensor from the 3DS, which means it will never go into sleep mode even when removed from the dock. Not ideal. Or I can design something that keeps the console open and or blocks the magnet. Let's try a few things. I've made a couple of spaces that slide in place, but they don't block it from going to sleep. I'm going to need to use a magnet or something. I've tried using this little magnet I had laying around to trick the sensor and it seemed to work. So I'm going to design a new slide piece with a slot for the magnet, which will hopefully solve our last obstacle, so we can finally play the 3DS docked. But the magnet really didn't want to cooperate. I'm really not sure what was going on, so I just tried a small thick piece of metal I had instead, which is a CR2032 coin battery. And it works. And super coincidentally, it's also the same dimensions as that magnet. So it should just slide into the piece I've already printed, just like that. Hey, I'll add some tape to avoid scratching the console. And problem solved. Let's get it plugged in for the final test boot. It works! It works! Excellent. And we can access our menu to make the display look a little nicer. So that's that feature checked off the list. Next is the Switch Pro controller, searching and connected as player 1, blue connected light on the controller's status LED. And with this useful little app 3DS test, we can see that all of the buttons are mapped over and functional. The biggest question on my mind right now is latency. So let's do a quick race in Mario Kart 7 to see if there is any noticeable delay. Audio works and sounds great. Analog stick works perfect, and I honestly can't feel much latency at all. But how about a DS cartridge? This is mainly because the softmod wireless streaming and controller input redirection software only works on the 3DS menu and in 3DS games, not DS games. So those other consolizer setups won't be able to do this, because this true consolizer setup is an entirely hardware-based modification and doesn't even require custom firmware in the first place. So it streams and controls DS games too with ease. How was that? What do you think? We've nailed all of the goals that we set out at the beginning, and I think we've built something really special, and the first of its kind. And it works perfectly too. Thanks for watching. This is the biggest project we've done on the channel so far, and I've got plenty more ideas to be turned into reality soon. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss them when they drop. And hit that like button if you want to see more videos on the 3DS or the Switch. Or if you had something else in mind, let me know in the comments. Goodbye.